The other day I was looking at footage of the new Cuphead DLC and was like, wait a minute, it's been 5 years since that game came out. And I was like, wait a minute, where did all the video games go? If you are a gamer or were one, you understand a lot more than movies or TV. Gaming has up years and gaming has down years. You end a year like 2015 and like 10 titles are vying for Game of the Year across all your favorite websites and separate YouTube critics. Witcher 3, Bloodborne, MGS5, Fallout 4, Arkham Knight, Undertale, Rocket League, all legitimate contenders for the title of the year's best. And they were rounded out by quality products like Rise of the Tomb Raider, Splatoon, and Super Mario Maker. And then you have a year where Dragon Age Inquisition is the runaway winner. The lesson is that in certain years you know you're not going to get a lot, and in others you're going to have such quality titles that gaming is going to transcend the barriers of popular culture and matter just as much or even more than television or movies. But gaming requires those banner years in order to justify the lacking quality of the other years. And for the past 4 years, well, we've just had bad ones. You can't just chalk up the subpar quality of the past few years to COVID. Granted, the pandemic certainly did slow the industry down more than others, but when you have FromSoft delivering a game as expansive as Elden Ring, that just doesn't cut it. It's been a disastrous mix of, yes, the pandemic, slow-ass progression on titles, and big games that matter miserably failing upon release.
This match will get red hot.
In 2019, you definitely saw Control take some sneaky Game of the Year wins, but it was largely Sekiro Shadows Die Twice that was the big name dominating come awards time, which is important because how deep the Game of the Year competition goes is generally a good indicator of how good the year in gaming is. Not only was 2019 light on titles, but highly anticipated ambitious projects like Shenmue 3, Kingdom Hearts 3, Days Gone, and most of all, Death Stranding were serious disappointments that led to a huge blow in quality to the year's lineup, especially PlayStation's. Now, Nintendo lives in its own fucking world, so you kind of have to count them separately, but their titles were mostly filler for bigger projects down the road, which is why you had stuff like Luigi's Mansion 3 and a new Fire Emblem. It's not that Pokemon on Switch was regarded as bad, just a lot less innovative and remarkable than people had hoped.
A brawl is surely brewing.
2020, believe it or not, started off the next console generation in miserable fashion with a little indie game called Hades, still not as praised as something like Inside or Hollow Knight, beating out titles that should have been way better. Half-Life Alyx was a more than pleasant surprise, but titles such as Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Spider-Man Miles Morales, Ghost of Tsushima, and the F7 remake coming on arrival and just being way too run-of-the-mill games, sharing too much in common with other titles and predecessors to make an impact. 2020 had the biggest slew of disappointments when it came to the titles, or at least it had a couple that were so anticipated and fell so short. As The Last of Us 2, the sequel to one of the greatest games of all time, effectively turned the first game's most ardent supporters against Naughty Dog and dealt a huge blow to their credibility. The game is not talked about nearly as much as the first one, despite 2 years since its release, and with a purposefully incendiary storyline as well. And there's Cyberpunk 2077, which speaks for itself.
A great slam and then some.
For 2021, you just had a light selection more than anything else. I mean, IGN's contenders for Game of the Year included Deathloop, It Takes Two, Metroid Dread, Psychonauts 2, RE Village, and another Ratchet & Clank. Holy poverty. I mean, I love Ratchet & Clank, but if it's on a major publisher's end of the year list, you know you had a light as hell year, with still some disappointments in the form of Halo Infinite, and boy howdy, the GTA PS2 Trilogy Remaster. What a disgrace that was.
Good day for a swell battle.
This year, you got Elden Ring leading the pack, which is nice, but it's followed by Horizon 2, which still has some opposition because it's so much of a retread of the first game, and the aforementioned Cuphead DLC. And what do people have to look forward to? A horrible fall slate where Overwatch 2 is gonna bust, and a reasonably dense 2023 calendar, still with a likely bust in the form of Starfield, which it just looks too much like No Man's Sky to not be the worst thing ever. And so the next question is, what's going on? What is causing the lack of really solid video game titles? And to me, the big word is complacency. We always associate laziness and complacency with the least respected companies in gaming. It is what is defined and what will continue to define companies like EA and Ubisoft, but it's creeping into other studios and companies as well. This naturally leads me to my next point, which is, fuck Xbox. Listen, Game Pass was a smart decision on Xbox's part, a brilliant one even, that gives access to previous games to players that want to play them and is able to rake in money like a streaming service does. The problem isn't that Game Pass is necessarily gypping consumers, but it's Xbox wanting to prey on an old library of games and the idea that they are quote-unquote committed to multiplayer, so the new stuff they pump out can just be another Forza Horizon, like that means anything at all. Why maximize the potential of Sea of Thieves? Why bring back Halo to its former glory days when we can just use old titles or new ones with lesser quality at a cheaper price that players think they're getting a deal out of, as opposed to refined new titles that they have to pay a little more for? I don't think Game Pass is intrinsically terrible. I see why some people like it, but it is in total opposition to my philosophy on how companies should focus on games. And well, Xbox really has always been directly against my philosophy on gaming in that regard. You could argue that Xbox recognizes this weakness, and it's why they're buying companies like Bethesda to ultimately, as an endgame, get exclusives that are of a higher quality to their name. But with something like Starfield looking so hollow of an experience, I just can't help but think that the Microsoft higher-ups are just putting pressure on game developers to just get these titles out as opposed to really refining them. Because ultimately, they're going to make money no matter what, so you might as well make the most possible. And hey, that's their prerogative as a business. It's just not going to make me like them anymore. And it's ultimately what has made me against Microsoft for so many years, that they don't really care about new quality exclusive titles. But now PlayStation is doing that too! Why are we getting The Last of Us again? Why was your launch exclusive title just a glorified DLC to Spider-Man? Why are you not supporting physical media? PlayStation I honestly am more disappointed in because I hold them to a higher standard, but their exclusives have either been complete dumpster fires or good ones, but just eerily similar to their predecessors. And then you got Nintendo. Out of the big three, Nintendo has been the most consistent, but they are also taking their sweet-ass time getting everything out. People really enjoyed Animal Crossing, Fire Emblem, the new Pokemon, Metroid Dread, the new Kirby game, but these titles all feel like filler to the overly long waits for Breath of the Wild 2, Odyssey 2, or the next Mario game, and Metroid Prime 4. None of them have that big-time Nintendo feel that they absolutely can muster in these years, like 2013, where the smaller games are so polished that it doesn't matter that it's a Fire Emblem or 2D Zelda we're getting. Awakening and A Link Between Worlds were so good that everyone felt the necessity to play them as well. And hey, I don't want these poor game designers rushed. They're some of the hardest working, least compensated people in the world, but there's this horrible trend of major titles either being rushed out as soon as possible or being stuck in development hell for years and killing the excitement behind them, or raising expectations so high that the games never can live up to those impossibly high standards. Of course, the better alternative is for the Cuphead makers to take their sweet time and make the most polished product possible, but I think we can agree that 5 years for a handful of bosses is in fact testing the patience of fans, many of whom stopped following the industry between those years. These companies need consistent releases for titles to keep people engaged, and it seems across many studios there lacks a fire under developers' behinds to get out quality products in a reasonable amount of time. But that's coming from the larger names porting, remastering, and barely expanding on games to oblivion, all for the sake of money. It's not just individual games, but the industry as a whole that feels a lot less important than it has in previous years. And I think the off times are really just as or even more important than the on times for gaming, which is usually the fall. But it's those off times where you get excited about developments, about companies trying to outmaneuver each other, about the big three console names trying to sell even more units, that really makes gaming exciting to follow, that drives momentum when you have nothing to play at all. And I think there's just not necessarily an animosity that's missing that I want to return, but just some sense of competition that drove so much of the innovation and creative video game making that defined the 2010s. Do you just feel a lack of urgency in Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo? Because these three behemoths of gaming, in my opinion, took every opportunity possible for a time to take jabs at each other, to get ahead of each other, and now they're just so comfortable in where they're at that it feels as though that they've gotten so familiar with what people think of them, what people think makes them great, that as soon as they try to capitalize on it, they stop being good at their niche. And listen, you can poke a lot of holes in this argument. You could say that ultimately this comfort that each company has likely is resulting in game developers ultimately getting a higher quality of life and more job security. And if that's the case, by all means, continue this trend in gaming. Go forth and prosper. But when you have occasional horror stories coming out from something like Blizzard, it just seems that the quality is not rising across the entire industry and that everyone just isn't doing so great right now. People who faithfully play video games are going to look at this title and think that, well, The games haven't gone anywhere, you've just stopped playing them. And that's somewhat reasonable. I am, after all, an outsider looking in, but I would contend that, well, if you engage in a medium consistently enough, of course you're going to stumble across quality every once in a while. It's just that in the past couple of years, we have seen an unnatural amount of highly anticipated games missing their mark. We've seen a release schedule ill-defined by deadlines that are either way too harsh or way too lenient, and we see these big console names looking to their past generations, past titles to prop up the current one. And I guess that's all for today's video, because that's just the state of gaming today. Yep. Except fuck that narrative. I have every shred of faith that the video game industry is going to rebound. It's just that there needs to be an attempt, some sort of coup to recapture that fire, that spark that has defined gaming for so many years. We need God of War Ragnarok to be the 10 out of 10 masterpiece that people hope it to be. We need Microsoft to do one thing right and get out one quality title, and I will be impressed. We need Nintendo to give us news on stuff that actually matters, like Metroid Prime 4. We need Capcom to deliver an excellent multiplayer game in Street Fighter 6. So many things are relying on the next 365 days, and we need big titles to actually hit the mark to change gaming as we know it. Something like GTA 6 being announced would go a long way in reminding everyone why gaming is such a fascinating and distinctly awesome medium from something like TV and movies. And I hope that in the coming future, I will be able to say that I am a gamer again. And that is all for Lightspeed Brothers.